All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 20, Section 2, the key political issues, patronage, tariffs, and gold. So during the Gilded Age, like the title says, patronage, tariffs, and gold were kind of the major political discussions to be had. On the issue of patronage, essentially the two positions were spoils system versus civil service, and this has a lot to do with government positions. The spoil systems or patronage was to appoint people to government positions based off of things like loyalty, friendship, and even some cases corruption. The idea is that you reward those people who are loyal to you by giving them a very comfortable job. The civil service section favored more of something like a test, ability, merit. They were more for reforming the corruption that was being had there. So, the idea of who should staff the government and how they should be staffed, whether it should be through spoils systems or patronage, or should it be done through civil service, was of course a major issue. So much so that it split the Republican Party. These stalwarts were a term used to describe those who favored the spoils/patronage. And the half-breeds were, of course, those who were reform-minded and favored civil service. And so this played out in the election of 1888, was it? Maybe 1876, 1880 is what I'm looking for. The election of 1880, which saw the election of James Garfield, who was a Republican, but was also a half-breed. So he was somebody who favored more of the civil service reform-sided issue of this. His vice president was Chester Arthur, who was also a Republican but was a stalwart, right? So this guy was vice president. And the idea by choosing a stalwart and a half-breed, one president, one being vice president, of course, was to unite the party. And it was successful in getting Garfield elected to the presidency in 1880. However, Charles Guiteau, however you pronounce it, assassinated James Garfield. So he was Garfield's assassin. And the reason was because he wanted to see Chester Arthur become president, because he was a stalwart supporter, right? He supported more of this side, the spoil/patronage side. So when James Garfield was assassinated, he was shot in the back and he died, in fact, some time afterwards. Chester Arthur became president, but to the kind of surprise of many, he actually embraced this reform/civil service side. They called him a man without a party, because he had kind of flipped his position, so to speak. And when he became president, he was responsible for the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which said at least 10% of government positions would be staffed via a test rather than being appointed by your friend. So this was one of the first major laws that promoted civil service. All right, civil service. The second main issue of the Gilded Age was the issue of tariffs. If you're not familiar, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. And really the way that tariffs played out, especially during the Gilded Age, was that high tariffs were favored by business. Right. So if you're Andrew Carnegie, for example, you want high tariffs because you don't want to have to compete with foreign steel companies. So if foreign steel companies want to import that steel to the United States, well, they have to pay a tax or a tariff, which means that Carnegie or American businesses can charge more. It leads to higher profits. Whereas those who favored low tariffs mostly were the consumers. right? If you're buying stuff, you want it to be as cheap as possible. Now, granted, American businesses, American businesses don't have to pay this tax, but if you buy any foreign goods, you're essentially paying more money for goods. So high tariffs were a choice of business. Low tariffs were the choice of consumers. Now, over these issues of civil service and tariffs, you had a faction of the Republican Party break away. The mugwumps were a faction of the Republicans who broke away and eventually supported the presidency of Grover Cleveland, who became the first Democratic president since the Civil War. And especially in the Gilded Age, where we talked about the vote was pretty much 50-50, just the fact that you had a very small group break away, their vote became incredibly important. And in fact, Grover Cleveland even courted the mugwumps, these kind of dissenting Republicans, in order to get elected. And Grover Cleveland was more of a reform-minded individual as well. You know, he challenged some of the businesses. A great example was the Interstate Commerce Act of 1877, which really targeted railroads, we'll say railroad companies, for price gouging. You know, railroads were one of the first big mega businesses in the United States. They were some of the richest people who had ever lived. And the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 was also not just a law that targeted railroads for price gouging, which they could change the price of you know what it costs to transport things on the railroads. It was the first federal regulatory board really in the United States history. So that was a big setup. The next election was won by Benjamin Harrison, who was a Republican. A lot of these presidents, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, we sometimes refer to them as the forgettable presidents because, again, this is a time period where there's very weak leadership and there's not really a lot done, you know, in terms of kind of the grand scheme of U.S. history. But you do see various laws passed under their various presidencies. So we'll just kind of name a few here. So for Benjamin Harrison, you see two laws regarding tariffs. The McKinley tariff was the highest tariff in the U.S. up until that point. I think maybe even the highest tariff, well, not the highest tariff in all of American history, but it had been the highest tariff up until that point. And of course, that would have been a position very much supported by businesses, right? Business interests. The Sherman Anti-Trust Act was another trust, being the legal entity in which monopolies, so this was effectively an anti-monopoly law. It was one of the first federal laws to take on trusts, right? These, I'll scroll down a little bit so you can see that. You know, trusts were these legal entities in which you had multiple owners of different companies who held enormous market power. And of course, one of the problems during the Gilded Age was that, you know, you had these just huge centers of economic power and they could, you know, abuse their powers. This law, this Sherman Anti-Trust Act, was largely not effective. You know, it's usually said that it didn't really have any teeth. So the last issue during the Gilded Age, politically speaking, was this issue of gold versus silver. So again, the three big political issues of the day were, the first one is spoils versus civil service. The second major issue, you might say, is tariffs, right? So write two, high tariffs versus low tariffs. The third major issue is gold versus silver. So what do we mean by gold versus silver? Well, we essentially mean what is the base of the monetary system, right? Monetary equals money. So of course there was, you know, paper currency that was being used at the time, greenbacks from the Civil War. But the question was, what should be the backing of that currency? What should be the basis of that currency? Should it just be gold, or should it be gold and silver. And more or less the positions that were held on this particular topic was that those who advocated only for gold, those were business, banks, right, finance. Those who supported gold and silver were typically farmers especially, but also consumers, right, consumers. And so that was the big debate, gold versus silver. Do you want silver to count towards the monetary system? Because if you do count silver, well, then there'll be more money to go around. And of course, who wants more money to go around? Well, it's the people who don't have it, right? The people who have all the money, they don't want more money to be around, because the more money that there is out there, the less that their money is actually worth. So that was the big debate in the Gilded Age. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act allowed for a certain amount of silver. So an amount of silver. Jeez, I can't write. An amount of silver to count towards, this is just ugly, the monetary system. All right, that's bad. So the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, an amount of silver would count towards the monetary system. So this would have been something that would have been supported by the pro-silver category or constituency.